mother reported him missing from this neighborhood. The next day, his body discovered between 24 and 48 hours later. His bloody remains, his hair discovered in a wooded area. Now 5 suspects are arrested. They were arrested Friday in connection to the death of 15-year-old Limber Lopez Funes.
After decades of terror, the El Salvador government has just done what everyone thought was impossible, completely whipping out the country's deadliest gangs. This massive crackdown operation was triggered by the unfortunate incident where the notorious cartel group MS-13 brutally ended the lives of 87 people on March 25, 2022. How did Salvadoran President Nayib Bukele and his cabinet manage to change the nation's history forever? Join us as we figure out how El Salvador just wiped out its brutal gangs in a flash. The Reign of Terror. In February 1980, El Salvador's Archbishop Oscar Romero addressed an open letter to then U.S. President Jimmy Carter requesting that military aid to the Salvadoran regime be stopped. Romero stated in this letter that the United States was providing aid to the very people who were taking over El Salvador and oppressing its people, while the Spaniards controlled El Salvador's resources and ruled Salvadorans with an iron fist. Romero craved peace for his people, but tragically, he paid with his life when he was slain just 3 weeks later. And the peace Archbishop Romero intended was eventually gained by Salvadorans about 40 years later, under President Nayib Bukele and his harsh anti-violence tactics. They went through their own battles, fights, and losses of lives during those 40 years of redemption. When government gunmen attacked during Archbishop Romero's funeral on March 31, 1980, a huge crowd of 250,000 Salvadorans gathered. Over 200 people were hurt, and 42 died in the brutal assault. They had no clue the worst was yet to come, although some culprits faced justice. 4 American missionary women got kidnapped on December 2, 1980, by 5 Salvadoran guards. Taken elsewhere, those guards, unalived, sexually assaulted and tortured them. Their bodies found the next morning sparked local and global outrage. U.S. President Carter temporarily cut aid to El Salvador in response. This allowed a group of citizens to organize and establish the Farabundo Marti National Liberation Front, also known as the FMLN, a paramilitary organization. These individuals responded to every attack planned by Salvadoran military factions by fighting fire with fire. Ronald Reagan's election as U.S. president brought about a significant change just as the FMLN was about to retake its nation. Reagan's administration increased financial assistance to the Salvadoran military by $10 million, of which $5 million was allocated for helicopters, grenades, guns, and ammunition. While some international leaders were baffled by this decision, a few more had joined in. The Salvadoran armed forces received significant training and tactical guidance from the Chilean military administration, and as part of Operation Charlie, the Argentine military dictatorship also supplied assistance to the SAF. In 1989, the FMLN's attacks on the Salvadoran armed forces demonstrated that the conflict was at a stalemate. Neither side seemed capable of attaining a strategic advantage. At the same time, world events were stripping away the foreign support that had sustained both parties. The collapse of the Soviet Union signaled the loss of crucial allies for the FMLN. On the other hand, the end of the Cold War shifted U.S. policy in that region as well. There was no longer a compelling reason for the U.S. to support the unsavory Salvadoran counterinsurgency. This reality, along with the aftershock of the countless homicides, prompted the U.S. to push for a peace settlement. While all this was going on, approximately 80,000 soldiers and civilians in El Salvador had lost their lives as a result of this war, and nearly all the country's population had fled to the U.S., settling mostly in L.A. and around California. And although the Salvadoran War was finally brought to an end, the violence in the country continued, and many individuals who had relocated to LA as refugees during the war became involved in gang violence. During this, the U.S. war on drugs and anti-immigration policies had become popular. This resulted in the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996, which called for the deportation of immigrants, documented or undocumented, with criminal records at the end of their jail sentences. The big shock to this story is the fact that these gang members weren't trained assassins or some kind of angry mob. They were actually young Salvadoran teenagers. Because of the aftermath of the war, several teenagers were left with no choice but to join a squad for protection. The birth of the gangs. During the war, several families got displaced, forcing hundreds and hundreds of victims to navigate their path all alone at an early age. Some of the reasons these youths would join these gangs were because of the sheer feeling of neglect and abandonment from family, as well as the normalization of violence in society. So with these gangs, they had found a sense of security, a sense of hope, and maybe a sense of belonging. All this would only cost their free will, as it now belonged to those gangs, notably the 18th and MS-13. These two gangs are quite similar, but their rivalry tells a different story. The 18th Street Gang, also known as Mara 18 or simply 18, is one of the largest transnational criminal gangs in LA, with around 30 to 50,000 members between the US, Mexico, and Central America. They're also allied with the Mexican Mafia, another US-based syndicate, and according to the FBI, some factions of the 18th Street Gang have developed a high level of sophistication and organization in carrying out their dealings. Members of 18th Street frequently identify themselves with their outfits, bearing the number 18 or frequently sporting teams like the Duke Blue Devils or the LA Clippers, among others. In Guatemala City, many bus drivers have been beaten by 18th Street members for driving through their territory. The bus drivers were often victims of robbery or extortion. In one particular case, a driver refused to pay the gang, and consequently, his son was brutally unalive a few moments later. Where the violence level of 18th Street ends, that of MS-13 begins. Although they may be rivals, MS-13 is significantly ahead when compared side by side, also known as Mara Salvatrucha 13. MS-13 members are direct descendants of the FMLN squad that fought in the Salvadoran War. Typically, they're impoverished young men and teenagers, often homeless and estranged from their families, who would survive by engaging in minor drug dealings, theft, and extortion of street vendors, along with some other small-time crimes. From a statistical point of view, El Salvador had the third highest femicide rate in the world in 2016. In 2016, 1 in 5,000 Salvadoran women were missing, and only 5% of femicide cases resulted in convictions. Many Mara Salvatrucha members cover themselves in tattoos, including their faces. Some would ink the words S. Salvatrucha, the devil horns, and the name of their clique from head to toe. However, in the early 2000s, the gang was moving away from face tattoos, making it kind of easier to commit crimes without being noticed. Members of MS, like many American gangs, would utilize hand signs for purposes of identification or communication. One of the most commonly displayed is the devil's head, which forms an M when displayed upside down. Their level of cruelty has resulted in some members being recruited by this Sinaloa cartel battling against Los Zetas in the Mexican drug war. Their wide-ranging activities have drawn the attention of the FBI and U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, who have jointly initiated wide-scale raids against known and suspected gang members, arresting hundreds across the U.S., but none of that stopped them, but instead made them stronger. In 2004, the FBI established the MS-13 National Gang Task Force to enhance collaboration among local and state law enforcement agencies, aiming to dismantle MS-13. Their primary strategy would involve them deporting gang members to their home countries rather than imprisoning them in the U.S. Following the failure of that strategy, the FBI formed alliances with law enforcement agencies in El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico, opening offices there to take on the gang directly. Over 6,000 police officers from 5 different countries were involved in a wave of arrests and crackdowns throughout the U.S. and Central America as a result of the strategy's notable effectiveness. In the United States, 73 people were captured, and over 650 MS-13 gang members were arrested. But it seemed like the more they were caught, the worse they got until one man showed up, Nayib Bukele. Before the administration of El Salvador President Nayib Bukele, no government had succeeded in breaking up the country's dangerous street gangs. But how was Bukele able to crack down on the gangs when others couldn't? Whipping out El Salvador's oppressors. Antonio Saka and other former Salvadoran presidents' initiatives served as the foundation for President Bukele's plan to halt gang violence. President Saka implemented the Super Mano Dura policy in June 2004, giving the Salvadoran military the authority to patrol gang-controlled regions, search suspected gang members at random, and make arrests based solely on their appearance. Due to this tactic, some 4,000 gang members were detained, which resulted in jail overloading in El Salvador. By 2012, these gangs had begun negotiations for a ceasefire. The MS-13 and 18th gangs, along with the Salvadoran government, declared a ceasefire in March 2012. Although there has been criticism of this truce, it has had a favorable effect, even if it appeared that the government was giving these gangs more sovereignty. El Salvador lost 16 lives on average a day in early 2012. By late March, that figure had fallen to less than 5. On April 14, 2012, for the first time in over 3 years, no lives were lost due to gang-related cases in the country. Overall, there were about 401 recorded losses in the month of January 2012, but in March, the number was only 188, which was like a 50% reduction, showing that this truce was actually effective. But sooner or later it fell apart, and violence plagued the streets again. By 2015, there were some 60,000 gang members in El Salvador, and 70% of the country's businesses were being extorted, leading to annual losses of $4 billion, according to estimates by the Salvadoran Central Reserve Bank. The homicide rate was at its peak, even higher than it had been during the Civil War. El Salvador had one of the highest rates of gang-related violence in the world. The country's homicide rate reached 103 homicides per 100,000 people registered that year, making it the most violent country in the Western Hemisphere. By 2018, the homicide rate had decreased to 52 homicides per 100,000 people. Violence originated from the 18th century Salvadorian struggle over land ownership, and then it escalated into political violence involving left and right-wing parties, and eventually it gave rise to the MS-13 and 18th Street gangs, who were in a racial hierarchy war in the U.S. with African-American gangs. In March 2022, MS-13 slaughtered 87 people in 3 days. Knowing the country's history of violence, but this was on another whole level. This was pretty unusual in its ruthlessness. People with no ties to crime were targeted. A fruit seller, a surf instructor, a homemaker, a cobbler, anybody. These gangsters went after everybody, but their message was directed at one person, Nayib Bukele, who had promised to radically reduce crime and change El Salvador's image abroad. These gang members left corpses and human remains on the road leading to Surf City, a beachfront real estate on the Pacific coast that Bukele had renovated and renamed to attract international tourists. The story of this bloody massacre made headlines worldwide, and it brought out Bukele's dark side. He began his infamous crackdown by declaring a state of emergency in the country. He created new policies allowing rival gang populations to mix up in prison, a practice that was never implemented in a bid to reduce prison violence. But authorities arranged hundreds of bare-chested prisoners in their underwear, pressed them tightly together in rows, and took pictures of them to send a warning to other gang members out there. Bukele used extreme legal measures in the face of democracy by authorizing new policies that really deprive Salvadorans of basic constitutional rights, such as the right to legal defense and freedom of movement, while simultaneously relaxing rules on making arrests and authorizing the state to intercept civilian communications. Under these strict laws, security forces have launched a swift and aggressive assault on gangs, apprehending members and suspected associates without warrants or solid evidence, significantly speeding up the process compared to previous crackdowns by other presidents. To clarify how effective this crackdown was, El Salvador recorded 33,000 arrests in the first few months. This is in addition to the fact that the state of emergency has suspended constitutional rights to legal defense, allowing authorities to detain individuals indefinitely on unclear charges without the necessity of an arrest warrant or supporting evidence. Detainees are also denied the right to a lawyer and a court hearing within 72 hours of arrest. Even civil society organizations report being unable to communicate with those detained. Arrests are now often based on unverified intelligence, rumors, and information sourced from unusual places like social media profiles. Additionally, the Bukele administration has enacted new laws aimed at keeping gang members imprisoned for longer periods. Jail sentences have been heightened for gang affiliation, and the option of house arrest for individuals associated with these gangs is no longer an option. In February 2023, Nayib Bukele ordered the transfer of 2,000 people accused of gang membership to a recently opened mega-prison in the country. This mega-prison has the capacity to hold a staggering 40,000 inmates. The complex is located about 74 kilometers southeast of the capital, San Salvador, and it is made up of 8 buildings, each with 32 cells that hold more than 100 people. The disturbing detail here is that each cell has only 2 sinks and 1 toilet. The prison wardens hide up in ski masks to avoid becoming targets if these members actually do get out. To delve deeper into the matter of venturing outside, many critics believe subjecting these prisoners to such a level of cruelty would have an impact on El Salvador's economy once they got out. But according to Bukele, they won't ever be getting out. But how exactly did Bukele manage to halt this century-old cycle of violence? To fully understand this, we need to first understand who Nayib Bukele was and the violence that impacted his youth. The leader with the iron fist. Nayib Armando Bukele. Ortez was born on July 24, 1981 in San Salvador, El Salvador. His father was Armando Bukele Catan, a businessman and industrial chemist, and his mother is Olga Marina Ortez. Bukele's father died in 2015. Bukele was the couple's first child. He has 3 younger brothers, Karim, Youssef, and Ibrahim. He also has 4 half-sisters and 2 half-brothers from his father's side of the family. Bukele's father converted to Islam from Christianity in the 1980s, became an imam, and founded 4 mosques in El Salvador. Bukele's mother is a Roman Catholic. Bukele's paternal grandparents were Palestinian Christians who immigrated to El Salvador from Jerusalem and Bethlehem in 1921. Bukele's maternal grandfather was a Greek Orthodox, and his maternal grandmother was a Roman Catholic. Bukele completed his secondary education at the Escuela Panamericana in 1999 at the age of 18. He enrolled at the Central American University in San Salvador to study judicial sciences with aspirations to become a lawyer, but he dropped out to work for the NOLC advertising agency, one of his father's businesses. NOLC campaigned for the Farabundo Marti National Liberation Front, known as FMLN, a left-wing Salvadoran political party. The presidency and the assembly, however, were controlled by the Alianza Republicana Nacionalista, or ARENA, which was founded in the early 1980s by a member of a right-wing death squad. The party catered primarily to the business elite, but its members included ex-military men and religious conservatives. In 2009, an accumulation of corruption scandals sank the arena, allowing the FMLN to gain power, which it held onto for the next decade. Bukele officially joined the FMLN in 2012 and campaigned to be elected as the mayor of Nuevo Cuscatlan, a municipality in the department of La Libertad, which is a part of the San Salvador metropolitan area. Bukele's campaign was supported by the Democratic Change political party. He won the election, and due to the huge impact he created, the FMLN encouraged him to run for mayor of San Salvador, which he did. By this time, the FMLN were trying to soil his political future with their shady past, at which point Bukele was forced to cut him off and start a new party. The party, that led him to becoming president. On June 1, 2019, Nayib Bukele was elected as the 43rd president of El Salvador. He became the youngest head of state in Latin America, inaugurating a new national beginning. His first step to eradicating these gangs was to negotiate a peace treaty, as reported by the local newspaper, El Faro. Less than a week after the story was published, Bukele announced that the government would investigate El Faro for money laundering. Ever since then, he's attacked the newspaper relentlessly, sometimes calling out journalists by name. A few of them were even forced into exile. Many others have adopted the practice of just leaving the country after publishing a story and waiting to return until the threats have died down. The newspaper has a large international following. But inside El Salvador, Bukele's campaign against it has succeeded. Many people have come to see El Faro as partisan and unreliable. Furthermore, the Salvadoran National Assembly passed a questionable law to block news outlets from reporting on gang situations. Journalists could face up to 10 years in prison if they try to reproduce or transmit information that might have come from gang sources or could otherwise panic the public. The initiative might be impressive, but how effective was this crackdown? The end of gangs. According to multiple sources online, areas and neighborhoods in El Salvador that were plagued by these gangs for decades are now free from their strongholds. Few residents reported seeing remnants of the gangs in their neighborhoods, while some mention the return of active gang members who were released from jail. But people said these gangsters held far less power than before the state of emergency. Also, before the state of emergency, gang members extorted people working for small and medium-sized businesses, including street vendors, shop owners, bus operators, and taxi drivers in communities under their control. But now that all that's in the past, an owner of a abuse company who previously paid around $6,000 in monthly extortion fees to two main gang factions said he stopped paying immediately after the crackdown began. The Salvadoran police also reported a 54% reduction in extortion complaints between the start of 2022 and September 2022. Ironically, this method, while deeply concerning, has proven to be the most effective crackdown in El Salvador's history. The only question left to answer right now is, can this Bukele type of crackdown be accepted by other countries plagued by gang violence around the world? Global fight against cartels. Approximately 75,000 people have been imprisoned as a result of Mr. Bukele's organized crime operation, which means that 1 in every 45 adults is behind bars. Currently, other community leaders are paying attention and have discussed taking many of the same extreme steps to combat their own criminal violence. Even if they wished to compromise in the same way as Bukele's administration did, using measures that are obviously incompatible with democracy to make the streets safer, they are unlikely to succeed because Mr. Bukele's political rise was made possible by El Salvador-specific circumstances that are not transferable. Bukele's presidential actions have been denounced by the US, the EU, and the associations of US states. He is charged with threatening to use force against members of Congress, dismissing magistrates from the Supreme Court, and installing judges in their place who have permitted Bukele to run and win a second term in violation of the Constitution. In addition to helping Salvadorans unite against a shared foe, international criticism has elevated Bukele and his 6.5 million-person nation to global prominence. Conversely, this small nation is now run as a police state. Soldiers and officers sweep citizens off the streets and into prisons indefinitely, without providing a reason or allowing them access to a lawyer. There are credible reports that inmates have been tortured and, in some gruesome cases, unalived. In 2022, Madame President of the neighboring country of Honduras, Ms. Xiomara Castro, declared a war against extortion, following in Bukele's footsteps. Now, in her case, the homicide rates may have decreased, but gangs still remain powerful. Going further south, Ecuador is reeling from its own explosion of gang violence. Some citizens say they want a man like Bukele to wipe out the violence and come to set things right. And even in Chile, historically both a stronger democracy and a safer country than El Salvador, citizens claim to want a man like Bukele. But Bukele copycats and those who believe his model can be replicated in other Latin American countries overlook one key point. The conditions that allowed Bukele to wipe out El Salvador's gangs are some that are only special to El Salvador. Their gangs were one of a kind and far from the most formidable criminal organizations in the entire region. For decades, just a few gangs fought themselves for control of specific territories, and when put in comparison to the powerful cartels in Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil, El Salvador's gangs weren't big players in the drug trade and were more focused on extortion. Compared to these other groups, they were poorly financed and not as heavily armed. Another thing to make note of here is that once Mr. Bukele arrested the major leaders, the gangs just crumbled. Comparing that to another syndicate around Latin America, where criminal organizations are wealthier, more internationally connected, and much better armed than El Salvador's gangs once were taking the cartels in Mexico, for example, the Mexican war on drugs, though it didn't involve strict legal policies like that of Bukele, resulted in the arrests of hundreds of cartel drug lords. Yet because these cartels were so coordinated and well-structured, almost nothing changed. Instead, they just fought back, and in some cases, new criminal groups quickly filled in the void drawn in by the drug trade's huge profits. Colombia Escobar's war on the state in the 80s and 90s tells a similar story. No matter how hard the Colombian government hit this organization, his backlash was stronger. El Salvador also had more formidable and professional security forces committed to crushing these gangs when Bukele called on them compared to some of its neighbors, like Honduras, where gang-sponsored corruption among security forces apparently runs deep. This circumstance helped doom President Castro's attempts to imitate, like what Bukele did from the start. Going back to Mexico, criminal groups have reportedly succeeded in co-opting high-ranking members of the military and police. Similarly, in Venezuela, there have been reports of military officials running their own drug trafficking operations. So even if the president sends soldiers and police to do Bukele-style mass roundups, security forces may not be prepared or just may have reason to undermine the task at hand. And finally, Bukele faces very little political opposition, considering there aren't really any parties to oppose his government in many other Latin American countries. There are more robust political parties or opposition forces in place that would help keep an overreaching executive in check. Most governments out there have never agreed to enforce the types of policies Bukele enforced. It just isn't that constitutional. While the crackdown's impact in El Salvador was transformative, the gangs aren't finished. In fact, the government's own data contradicts the Bukele administration's narrative that the gangs have been completely defeated. In October 2023, Bukele's administration claimed to have arrested 52,541 members of MS-13, 13,683 members of Barrio 18 Surenos, and 10,741 members of Barrio 18 Revolucionarios, but these figures were overhyped. Official data from the Salvadoran Police Department shows that over half of the people detained during the emergency are not members of established gangs. In particular, about 32,331 gang members, 41,733 suspected collaborators, and 3,435 people were under investigation. At least 36% of gang members, collaborators, and over 42,000 people are still at large. Therefore, is the Bukele strategy applicable to other nations? Essentially, other nations that try to copy his model are likely to imitate only the negative aspects of El Salvador's scheme rather than its positive aspects. Governments may find themselves trapped in disorder when criminal organizations either grow in size or retaliate with sufficient force. In the process, they may reduce the amount of room for open government and civil society and jam more inmates into already congested jails. In the past, Latin American presidents who weren't fully committed to democracy were eager to take some or all of these steps for political gain. So maybe fighting crime is the best reason for all of its success in lowering crime, but the Bukele model has a very high price. Therefore, it might really transform everything if these presidents and leaders are prepared to pay that price. Do you think these brutal gangs are gone for good? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more interesting videos. Thanks for watching.